What is the best place in the world to go off-grid and live self-sufficiently like I do here? That is the question that I want to tackle in this video. But there's a lot of variables at play here. Availability and price of land, access to healthcare, to education, to employment if you need it, safety, language. These factors and many others besides depend a lot on your individual circumstances. So instead, I want to focus on climate, because climate determines how easily you can produce your own food, which just about everyone living off-grid aspires to do in some form. And for most people, it also constitutes their biggest living cost. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mossy Bottom. Yes, it's been a while since my last video, but I am still here in County Sligo in the west of Ireland. We've had an extremely wet couple of months, you wouldn't know it today, but as you can see, I'm still harvesting plenty of vegetables, despite December only being a few days away. I'll give you a kind of tour as the video goes on, but bonus points to anyone who can identify what the beauty I'm about to harvest is called. I'll give you a clue, it's not a giant mutant carrot, although that would be nice, I have to say. I'll reveal the answer later in the video. Does it even fit in the screen? Oh, this thing has got to be, I reckon 10 kilos at least. Over the years, one of the comments which I keep seeing in my videos is, why did you choose Ireland? If you haven't worked it out already from my very English accent, yes, I grew up in the UK, and that's why I say Ireland and not Ireland, like the locals do, or Ireland, like you folks in North America would. And right now I'm having my welly chewed off by this lovely donkey. These aren't mine, these are my neighbour's donkeys, but I do love coming in here as often as I can to say hello. Hopefully I don't get my welly chewed off entirely though, that wouldn't be very nice. Where was I? So, why did I choose Ireland as a place to set up this life? Well, it's close to where I grew up, it's English speaking, and I'd already been living and working here in Ireland for many years down in County Cork, so I knew the country pretty well already at that stage. It's also incredibly safe, and property was affordable. That was a big part of the reason. Ouch! Also, I considered the climate here to be pretty good for the self-sufficient life, which I've since been living now for over 6 years. But not everyone agreed. So were they wrong, or was I? Does Ireland have a good climate for living off-grid and growing your own food? And are there better options out there? Before I tackle those questions, I first want to tell you about Ren, the sponsor of this video. And I'm delighted to be working with their team again this year, because Ren is a website where you can calculate your own carbon footprint by answering some simple questions about your lifestyle and then offset that with a monthly contribution, which helps to fund carbon reduction projects around the world, like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. And what I love most about Ren's projects, just have a look through their website if you're curious, is how innovative they are. Like using rice husks and maize cobs to create charcoal briquettes to be used as cooking fuel by refugees living in Uganda. It's projected that 1 million trees a year could be saved through this project, and that's a lot of carbon. And of course it's recycling waste, and it's directly helping people in desperate need. Just as important is how transparent and accountable Ren are when it comes to reporting. Projects are monitored with satellite imagery, you receive monthly updates from the projects that you support, and as a public benefit corporation, they release a financial report each year of their spending. If you have any doubts, take a look at their Trustpilot page, it really speaks for itself. They've so far raised over $4 million, which is fantastic, but as we all know, there's a lot more to do. This video is all about comparing climates in different parts of the world for people interested in self-sufficiency like me. But the reality is that those climates will rapidly change in the next century, as they already have in many parts of the world, including here in the west of Ireland. It's not just numbers on a page anymore. It's crops devastated, its livelihoods destroyed, its biodiversity wiped out. It's real and it's happening. Many people in the world aren't in a position to do anything about it. But if you are, and you're willing, then Ren is a great option. I don't think you'll find a better one. You can find out more on ren.co, where you can offset your carbon footprint right now. The first 100 people who sign up using the link in the description below will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. So, to determine just how good the Irish climate is for food growing, let's first talk about hardiness zones. And there are two different systems here. The RHS scale in the UK and the USDA scale, which has been around for longer, since the 60s I think, and it's more globally recognised, so let's stick to that. Here's a map of the USDA hardiness scale as it relates to Europe, and you can see that Ireland is somewhere between an 8 and a 9 on that scale. Mossy Bottom, my little homestead here, is actually right on the boundary between 8 and 9. Here's a map of the US for comparison's sake, and you can see that Ireland actually has the same hardiness rating as northern Florida, which at first glance is really surprising because Ireland and Florida don't seem to have a lot in common in terms of climate. Of course, hardiness rating just tells you one thing: how cold does it get in the winter? The reason hardiness has become synonymous with gardening and what plants you can grow is because it determines what perennials will survive through the winter based on just how cold tolerant they are. And it's probably fair to say if you plant a fig tree or an olive tree in a sheltered location in my garden here in County Sligo, it's got about the same chance of surviving the winter as it would have in northern Florida. But does that mean you'd get the same amount of fruit in the summer? Definitely not. Because although the winter low temperatures are about the same, the summer highs are completely different. Just take a look at this graph comparing the two. It's really only in the dead of winter that the low is within a degree or two. The other thing to remember is that most vegetables are annuals, not perennials, meaning you plant and harvest them in a single growing season. So winter lows are pretty much irrelevant as long as you can avoid that last frost of spring when you plant them out and harvest them before the first big freeze in the autumn. It really doesn't matter how cold it gets in the winter months. In fact, cold winters bring with them big advantages. Firstly, if the ground freezes, then that will kill or it will at least suppress many species of perennial weed, which in a country like Ireland keep growing year round. It really is like a rainforest here, and that can be a huge problem in terms of weeding. Freezing winters also kill soil and airborne diseases like potato blight. And cold winters make it much easier to store produce because colder temperatures mean drier air, and that's lower humidity, which means less mold and less rotting of your produce. Root cellars, they just aren't a thing here in Ireland because it's too wet. It may be nearly December, but look at these beauties that I've got. All of these rows behind me are still full of potatoes in the ground. Absolutely no mold or damage because we haven't had a frost yet. I can keep these in here right through the winter. I was way off with 10 kilos, folks. This thing has got to be more like 15, I reckon. Look at it compared to a fully grown tomcat. My goodness. Anyway, let's compare Sligo, where I live, to Calgary in Canada, where I spent quite a bit of time on my year volunteering. Very fond memories I have indeed. And here you can see, perfectly illustrated, that cold winter. Minus 11 degrees Celsius is the low. My goodness, that's cold. But also look at the difference in the summer between Calgary and Sligo. From April to October, it gets significantly warmer in Calgary than it does here. And it's often the case that locations with freezing winters have hot summers. Calgary is just a 3 or a 4 on the USDA Hardiness scale. But when it comes to growing most vegetables and fruit, particularly anything that requires ripening, it has a much better climate than Ireland. Of course, you do need to choose species of fruit tree that can survive those freezing winters, and you need to make the most of those short but intense summers. But if you're in any doubt though about it being better, just take a look at this graph. Growing degree days, that's the accumulation of growing degrees over an entire year, which plants can invest in growth. And you can clearly see Calgary is at about 800 degrees and Sligo at 600 degrees. That means here in Sligo, less heat, less photosynthesis, less growth, and particularly less chance of produce ripening. If it takes 30 minutes to bake a cake and you only put it in the oven for 20, then, well, it's just not going to be ready. And that's kind of the problem you have in climates like here with cool summers. Conversely, it doesn't matter how cold the oven gets when it's switched off, as long as it's hot enough when it's cooking your cake. I love my analogies. And that kind of implies that Ireland is a bad place to grow food, doesn't it? It's not looking good. More on that to come. The main point I want you to take from this is that hardiness zone certainly is not a measure of how hard or easy it is to be self-sufficient when it comes to food production. In fact, by not taking into account summer temperatures, it's kind of an irrelevant number. So, is Ireland a bad place to grow food? Well, those of you who followed my channel for a while will know that over the last 6 years I've grown a lot of food here, and I've only had a single polytunnel for 3 of those years, so by far the majority of what I've grown has been outside. In fact, there is a really big advantage to living in a hardiness zone of 8 or 9 like here in the west of Ireland. And that advantage is most apparent right now at this time of year. It's almost December and we still haven't experienced an overnight frost. It's still warm enough that all my leafy veg, you can see some of it here, brassicas, sprouts, broccoli, kale, cabbage, beets, chard, they're all still growing, albeit very slowly because there's not much sun, but they are growing. And my root veg like carrots, which are just behind the camera, and potatoes, they're all safely stored in the ground, protected from the cold. In Calgary, as a comparison, those frosts would have hit hard in October, and all this produce would have had to come out to save it from frost damage. So yes, in Ireland, with its mild winter and cool summer, it's hard to ripen produce. But you can start growing earlier, in February or March, and you can keep growing right through the winter. That's the big advantage. And it becomes most apparent when you're growing foods which don't require a lot of heat, like any kind of root or leaf crop, both of which need a lot of moisture too, which, yes, the Irish winters and summers amply provide. So if you live somewhere with cold winters and hot summers, you have a big advantage over me in terms of what you can grow and ripen in that summer season. Tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, pumpkins, peppers, and many other veg will grow outside and do really well. As well as, of course, fruit on trees and bushes, of which you'll get a lot more than me. But my trump card is that I can keep growing and harvesting leaf and root vegetables like these right through the spring, autumn, and even the winter. The Swedes grow pretty big here too, folks. Some of these have got so big I can't really eat them myself anymore, so the pigs get to enjoy them. So if you want to grow as much food as possible off-grid and be as self-sufficient as you can, where is the perfect climate? Well, it's got to be somewhere that combines both of those qualities. A hot summer with plenty of rain, like in Calgary, and a mild spring and autumn to extend that season, giving you a longer window of time to produce food, like here in Sligo. Places like that tend to be on the coast because air currents from the ocean keep coastal areas warmer during those typically colder months. Inland locations tend to have more extremes. But coastal regions are also cooler in the summer, so you probably need to go further south than here to make up for that. There's a couple of other things to consider when it comes to climate. One is rainfall. I've worked on organic farms, actually both in Canada and France, which needed quite complicated and costly irrigation systems because there just wasn't enough reliable rainfall during those summer months. It's okay if you just have a greenhouse or a polytunnel or a few raised beds to water, but if you've got acres, then it gets quite complicated in how you do that efficiently. Anyone who's seen the classic movie Jean de Florette will know exactly what happens on a homestead or small farm when it doesn't rain enough during the summer. That's definitely not a problem we face here in Ireland. The other factor is wind, and strong winds are the absolute nemesis of outdoor fruit and veg production. Blossom, like on these apple trees, is blown away in the spring. Stomata close and plants are knocked over and stunted in summer storms, which massively sets back the production of food. And I'm sure that's partly why Victorian veg gardens were surrounded by stone or brick walls. You often see that, don't you? Not only would those walls provide more thermal mass, more heat needed for photosynthesis and growth, but they'd also keep out a substantial amount of that wind, which, as I've experienced here in Ireland, can completely devastate vegetable crops. I am quite lucky though, because most of my land is in a kind of basin surrounded by trees and buildings which protects it from wind. And I do encourage that as a windbreak. Like along my north border here, where you can see I've planted these western red cedar trees to create a windbreak, hopefully protecting the fruit trees. But open land in a windy location, like most of these fields here in the west of Ireland, just isn't suitable for growing most plants. So our dream location would also have rainy summers, because that's why Ireland is called the Emerald Isle. Rain equals growth. And it would be quite sheltered without those strong winds or frequent storm events. I mentioned Portugal earlier because here in Europe it's a common choice for a lot of people. Let's do another comparison between Sligo, where I live, and Lisbon in Portugal. First, hardiness zone. Sligo is an 8 to 9, as I mentioned. Lisbon is actually a 10, meaning it almost never gets below about -2 in the winter. That's definitely handy for frost-sensitive perennials and fruit trees. And the absence of a deep freeze in the winter means you can grow right through the year. But then you can in Ireland too. Next, temperatures. Well, in Lisbon it gets really hot in the summer. Average highs of 28 degrees Celsius in July and August versus just 17 here in the west of Ireland. Porto in the north of Portugal is a bit cooler, but the problem isn't so much the heat, but the lack of rainfall during the summer. Yes, it's great if you're sat by a pool as a tourist, but if you're trying to grow food, you're going to need to be watering 2 or 3 times a day just to keep crops alive, not to mention the effect it would have on livestock. Let's look at wind. Well, Lisbon is right on the Atlantic Ocean, just like Sligo, so both are pretty windy, meaning you'll need a sheltered location for food production either way. Growing degrees. Wow, look at the difference here. 2,500 growing degrees in Lisbon versus 600 in Sligo. But how useful is that if it doesn't rain? So, which is better then? Well, either way, you're going to have problems to solve. In Sligo, it's lack of heat in the summer. The solution is protected cropping, greenhouses or polytunnels, and trying to warm the soil as much as you can prior to and during the growing season, as I do here with my hugel mounds and stone paths. In fact, you can see some of these strawberry plants are still flowering and producing fruit, even though it's nearly December. In Portugal, you need a sophisticated irrigation system and a reliable supply of water during those dry summers. Not just enough for you to drink, but for hundreds of very thirsty plants too. So finding somewhere with a river or lake on your land is potentially a big advantage in that kind of climate. Probably the best place in Europe for growing a broad spectrum of foods on a homestead would be somewhere like the Costa Verde in the north of Spain, which is a lot cooler than Lisbon, with summer highs in the low 20s, and a lot more rain during the summer, and less wind. But still enough heat in the summer for produce to ripen outside in a way it can't really here in Sligo. Though I have to say, I still think the west of Ireland would beat the Costa Verde when it comes to growing leaf and root crops like this. Did you identify it, I wonder? No, this is not a giant mutated carrot. It is in fact a mangelwurzel, a very, very big one, or mangold, which is actually a member of the beetroot family. And they taste very similar, I have to say. A bit more woody, which is to be expected considering the size. The leaves are really nice too, so all of it's definitely edible. But these are grown these days mostly for cattle or pig feed, and I started growing them for my coonies. But in the 1800s, they were apparently one of the 6 main food crops grown in workhouses here in Ireland to feed the poor, along with carrots, onions, cabbages, parsnips, and you guessed it, potatoes, all of which do exceptionally well in the Irish climate. The best thing about mangolds is just how ludicrously big they get. It still astonishes me that something so enormous, I can barely lift it with one hand, can be created by nothing but a tiny seed, a bit of sunlight, not much here, a lot of rain, and some fertile soil to grow in. Nature is truly incredible. Oh. Come on, Moss, let's go give us some pigs. The truth is, you can go off-grid and be self-sufficient in most climates. Maybe not Antarctica and a few others, but most places in the world to some extent, because every problem has a solution. If it's too cold to grow food in the winter, get really good at food preservation and build a root cellar. If it's too cool in the summer, germinate seeds earlier under cover. I start in February. And increase soil temperatures or invest in a polytunnel like I did. These are my peppers, still growing and ripening in late November. If it's too dry, create irrigation. If it's too wet, make sure you practice good crop rotation to reduce disease, and don't overplant. You need good ventilation in wet climates. If it's too windy, create windbreaks with walls, fences or trees, like I've tried to here. Self-sufficiency is all about ingenuity. So where's the best place in the world to live off-grid? Well, when it comes to climate, providing you're a good problem solver, which you should be if you aspire to live this life, probably wherever makes you happy. What do you think of this, eh, pigs? Does this meet with your approval? I think that's a yes. Pig, 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 pig. Some very happy pigs. Can you believe it's only 3:45 and it's already too dark to film? I hope you can still see me. Many of you have contacted me asking about the 2023 calendar, and I'm afraid after much consideration I decided that it just wasn't possible to produce one this year. The trouble is that everything has gone up in price so much in the last 12 months, particularly shipping costs, that it just isn't possible to make and send them without losing money. I do hope to bring them back in the future, as the photography and storytelling is something I truly love doing. I just need to figure out a way to make it more economical somehow. Perhaps a smaller calendar so shipping costs are reduced, or a way for you folks to print them so that they don't have to be shipped at all. If anyone has any suggestions on that front, please do let me know. My contact links are down in the description. There will be another video in December, I promise, providing I can get a break in the rain, of course. You wouldn't believe how tricky it's been this last few months. Stay tuned for that though, and thank you as always for your continued support. I know there are so many of you out there waiting eagerly for each new video, and of course supporting me on Patreon or through the website in the many ways that you do. I'll definitely see you before Christmas at least one more time, but for now, from me here at Mossy Bottom, and 2 very, very happy pigs in this mild, dark, and typically wet Irish climate. To you, wherever you are in the world, take care and bye for now.
Born in a Quaker town where folks worked good and hard for the ones they loved and got above. Each day they punched their card, and when evening came back home again, they'd rest a while and say, "'Tis a hard old life, but for kids and wife we'll work as another day." When the sun rose low, back to work they'd go, singing on their way. For job and home to call our own, we'll work as another day. Oh, I grew up.
Good donkeys. Good donkeys. Good donkeys. Over the years, one of the comments which keeps popping up in my videos is, why did you choose Ireland? If you haven't worked it out already from my very English accent, yes, I'm being chewed on by a donkey. Aren't they lovely? Ow. It's incredibly safe, property was affordable, and of course, I considered the climate here to be pretty good for the self-sufficient life which I've since been living. And I'm having my welly chewed off by this lovely donkey. You are an absolute scourge, you are. You are a scourge, but you're a lovely donkey. I feel like those guys that have caught a huge fish that stand there posing with it for all the photos. This is my huge vegetable